Hey there! Do you want to know how to get people to say yes to what you ask them to do? Check out this video for a scientific study that reveals when people are especially likely to help each other out. Okay, so there's a whole science of psychological influence, and one really neat study from a little bit ago gives us some insight into when we're likely to say yes to other people. It all comes down to familiarity, and it can be surprisingly easy to get people to feel familiar with you. In this study, what they did is they had a few different groups of people, all of which were randomly assigned as people walked into the room. Sometimes people would be in a situation where they'd have to complete an activity in a laboratory with another person present, and they were engaged in a conversation as part of that activity. Other times, people were doing the activity alone in exactly the same laboratory. In each case, though, the person, either who they've been talking to or having come from another room into your own room if you're the participant, this other person comes in and asks you a very simple question. I have an essay. Would you mind proofreading it for me? Simple enough, but do people comply? Are you going to say, yeah, sure, I'll read your essay? Or do you blow it off and say, there's no way I'm going to read your essay, why are you asking me? Under the conditions that the person asking for this favor was a stranger that the people had never seen before in the study, only 26% of the time did people say, yeah, sure, I'll read your essay. But when it was someone that you had been talking to in the course of this study, that rate doubles, and now nearly 50% of the time people are agreeing to read this essay written by someone who was a stranger to them only 10 minutes ago. This is all fine and good. It makes some sense, right? You're going to say yes to someone who you've gotten to know more than you would say yes to someone who's a total stranger. But this is where things get pretty crazy in their study. There was a third condition. So some of the time, people were doing this activity first with the partner who's going to then ask them for a favor. Some of the time, people are doing the activity by themselves, and then the person comes in from another room to ask them a favor. But some of the time, they're doing the activity with the other person, but they're not communicating. They're both independently doing the activities by themselves without ever talking to one another at all. So does that make it any more likely that they'll say yes to the favor? Person's still a total stranger, but a stranger that's just been sitting 10 feet away from them for a little while. Amazingly, people were just as likely to say yes to this person's request as they were when they had actually engaged in a full conversation with that person. So that means all you have to do to get someone to say yes to things you ask them to do is to just kind of be a familiar face. You don't even have to have done or said anything. Just being in the same room as the other person for a few minutes is enough to dramatically increase the likelihood that they'll do you a favor. So why does this happen? Why is it the case that you would be more likely to help someone if you had just been sitting in a room with them for a couple minutes? Well, the answer lies in something called mere exposure, along with a couple other principles of persuasion and influence. Mere exposure is basically the idea that we end up liking things the more we are exposed to them. So think about a song that comes on the radio that you've never heard before, and the first time you hear it, you're like, okay, fine, it's a song and it's on the radio. But then each time you hear it after that, you end up liking the song a little bit more until by the end of the week, you're belting that song out by yourself as you drive to work. The answer in all of that is mere exposure. The reason why you end up liking it is just that you've heard it enough times that it's become more familiar to you, and we just like things when they're familiar compared to when they're less familiar. And in persuasion, we end up being more helpful to people who we like. Just sitting in the same room as the other person made the other person more familiar, and then more likable, and then a person who you would help out when they ask you to do something. So the next time you need someone to do a favor for you, and you know that the person who could do that favor for you is at this point a stranger, take a moment to put your face in their vicinity. Become a familiar face, and it might mean the difference between a yes and a no and a punch in the face. For more social psychology, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or go to beapeopleexpert.com and find new articles every week about psychological science.